Live in just a moment. And I think it does a thing where you see it on the Zoom. Okay, I think we are. So go ahead.
Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm Karen Gibson. I'm a physics professor at Grand Valley and one of the co-organizers of the Roger That conference. It's my honor to introduce our special guest this evening, Dr. Leroy Chiao, who served for 15 years as a NASA astronaut. He flew 4 space missions, including 3 space shuttles and 1 Russian spacecraft that flew to the International Space Station, where he spent over 6 months living in space and performing science experiments. In fact, he was the commander and NASA science officer of that expedition. He was the first Asian and ethnic Chinese person to perform a spacewalk, as well as the first to serve as a mission commander. He's logged 229 days in space, over 36 hours of which were spent in extravehicular activity, EVA, or spacewalks. A native English speaker, Dr. Chiao also speaks Mandarin, Russian, and a little bit of German. He has flown with and worked closely with Russian, Japanese, and European astronauts and their affiliated space agencies. Prior to becoming an astronaut, Dr. Chiao earned his PhD in chemical engineering and worked as a research engineer. Since leaving NASA, he's worked as a governmental and business consultant, as well as in leadership positions in a variety of commercial space programs and commercial ventures, 2 of which he co-founded. In addition, he currently holds appointments at Rice University and the Baylor College of Medicine, and he's an advisor to the Houston Association for Space and Science Education, and he also serves on the NASA Advisory Council. Dr. Chiao is a fellow of the Explorers Club and a member of the International Academy of Astronautics. His professional honors are too numerous to name, but highlights include 14 NASA medals and awards. This evening, he's going to tell us about his journey to becoming a NASA astronaut. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leroy Chiao.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here at I believe this is the 5th GVSU conference and participating, via Zoom. Hopefully next time we can do it live, but I'm glad everyone could join. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation and share my screen. All right, and I'm going to start us off with a little intro video. All right. Well, as you heard from Karen's introduction, my name is Leroy Chiao, and I'm an astronaut. Over my 15-year NASA career, I did get to fly 4 times into space. My first 3 missions were aboard space shuttles, and on my 4th flight, I trained with the Russians. We launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, and we flew to the International Space Station, where I served as the commander and NASA science officer during Expedition 10, which was a 6.5-month flight. Well, I've always been interested in airplanes and rockets. I can't remember a time when I wasn't. Even when I was very young, I would look at pictures of airplanes in books. And as I got a little older, I would memorize how high and how fast they could fly. I'm not sure where this passion came from because no one else in my family really had the same fixation on it. The only exception would be my great uncle, my mother's uncle in China. He was taught to fly airplanes by the Americans during World War II. He went on to advanced training in the United States and returned to China to fly numerous combat missions, transitioning to bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, flew numerous combat missions over the Chinese mainland during the war. I was born in the United States. My family, my parents were both from the area outlined in red there called Shandong province in northern China. My father was from the western side of the province, from a small farming community. My mother was born in the beautiful port city of Qingdao on the eastern side of the province. And Qingdao, of course, is now world famous because of the Qingdao beer. The Chinese have probably been brewing beer for, I don't know, maybe 3,000 or more years, but they've only been brewing good beer for a few hundred years, ever since the Germans showed up and showed them how to do it right. And in fact, if you go to Qingdao today, you'll still see a lot of the government buildings have the red tiled roofs, the German architecture, and still a very beautiful city. So after the war, my parents both found themselves on the island of Taiwan, and they were still pretty young back then, young teenagers probably. And so then a few years later, when they were at university, that's where they actually met and ended up getting married. And my older sister was actually born on Taiwan. I never did get to meet that great uncle. He did survive the war, flying all those combat missions, and unfortunately was killed giving a demonstration flight in an airplane after the war. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and here's a picture of me in my first spacesuit of sorts. I grew up during the 1960s, during the very beginning of the space race and the space program, and it was right around then that my family ended up moving to California in the San Francisco Bay Area where I grew up. Now, my parents made a very conscious decision. They decided, and it was absolutely the correct decision, that we were not going to live in Chinatown or anything like that. We were going to live in mainstream American communities, and that the idea being that we, their children, would be able to assimilate more quickly into the American mainstream. As I said, that absolutely was the right thing to do, but especially growing up in the 1960s, once I got to junior high school, I was always the smallest kid in the class, and I was pretty much the only kid that looked different. And so that didn't always work out well for me, and I was definitely affected to a degree by bullying, right? What's today being called bullying. And and nowadays, of course, for young people, it's even more complicated because we have the cyberbullying with the advent of the electronic age, with social media and all the things that come with that. So what I did, I kind of used a judo move. Of course, being bullied is no fun, and you could see how that could really, cause you to go in a negative direction. But I kind of decided to use that to my advantage. I took that negative energy and I turned it around to motivate myself to work even harder in school and do as well as I could in school, and kind of promising myself that I was going to do something important in my life and be better than every one of those kids that had been giving me a hard time. And so, as you already know, it takes a lot of hard work. A lot of hard work to do anything worth doing takes a lot of hard work. But doing well in school, people often ask me, well, what is the secret to your success as an astronaut or getting into NASA? And I said, well, there's really no secret. It's the recipe for success is the same no matter what you want to do, and that is do the very best you can in school, and then take care of yourself, right? It's just as important to take care of your health. If your body is healthy and you're feeling good, then your mind is going to be able to perform at its optimum. So make sure you do the right things. You eat the right kinds of diet, and you get enough sleep. I mean, sleep is, we've always known that sleep is important, but actually only in recent years have we discovered just how important it is. It might surprise you, some of you out there, to learn that the human brain continues to develop till right around the age of 30. So it's not only important for very young people and children to get sleep, but even you've got to make it part of your lifestyle to get enough rest so that you can develop your brain to the fullest extent and continue to operate it at peak efficiencies. Exercise, same thing. We've always known exercise is good for you, but again, recent research into how important it is. It turns out that regular exercise, is really the single most important thing you can do. It has the biggest effect on your short and your long-term health. Of course, growing up in school, no matter where you go to school, no matter what kind of neighborhood you come from or live in, you're going to have the opportunity. I certainly had the opportunity to take drugs. And I can guarantee all the young people out there watching, think very carefully about the decisions you make, because the decisions you make today will definitely affect your life down in the future. Because I can guarantee you, if I had chosen to go down that path and started doing that, I can guarantee you I wouldn't be here today about to share with you some of the amazing adventures that I've had the good fortune to have being a NASA astronaut. Well, it starts with a dream, a passion. And what is it that really grabs your attention and kind of keeps you up at night? You know, what kind of gets you on fire? And for me, it was always flight. I never did learn how to fly airplanes until I was in graduate school. I was always too busy studying really hard, trying to get good grades and get through university. And once I got to graduate school and passed my PhD qualifying exams, I went right down to the airport there and started flying lessons. So I've been flying now for well over 36 years and still have this little airplane shown in this picture and still get to go out and fly now and then. Again, I mentioned that the early astronauts were my heroes, people like Alan Shepard, the very first American to fly into space. But it really was the Apollo moon program that captured my imagination and made me start to dream about wanting to become an astronaut myself. I was 8 years old when we landed on the moon with Apollo 11. And, you know, some of you out there, probably most of you out there, are too young to have been, to remember or to have been around for that event. And so NASA on the 50th anniversary, just about a year and a half ago, created a short video to kind of capture the excitement of Apollo 11, still the most watched live event in history.
At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Rocket Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
We're going to be busy for a minute.
Armstrong is on the moon.
Yeah,
Neil
step off the
Armstrong,
limb now.
38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. On this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful, beautiful. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation.
Tranquility Base, Houston, guidance recommendation is pinged, and you're cleared for takeoff.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, engine arm ascent. Beautiful. Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
Apollo 1, this is Apollo 11, reading you loud and clear. Our position 1330.
Wow, hard to believe that was 50 years ago. I was watching that old black and white TV set with the rabbit ear antennas, that fuzzy screen, watching the scene unfold in the Mission Control Center as Eagle approached the surface and then actually landed. And that's when it really hit me that, you know, a little later, I went outside and looked at the moon, and there, almost 250,000 miles away, 2 astronauts were getting ready to take those first steps. And so when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin did take those first steps, that's when it struck me that that's what I want to do. I want to be like those 2 guys on the moon, getting ready to go out and take those steps. So I did work hard in school and did end up getting my 3 degrees in chemical engineering, worked for a while. And then one of the other things that I wanted to bring up is that it's important to have that dream and work hard, but you also need to have the courage to go after that dream, right? And I want to tell you something that happened to me in university. I told some people that I wanted to be an astronaut, and they laughed at me. They started teasing me for the better part of a week. And it would have been easy for me to say, oh yeah, I was just kidding, or you're right, I would never get in, or something like that, and not even try. And even today, I'll meet people in different presentations, and they'll say, I always wanted to be an astronaut. And I said, well, did you try? well, no, why not? Oh, I wasn't very good at math. I wasn't that good in school. I'm like, well, it's too bad. You should at least try, right? Um, and so I always tell young people to find that inner lion inside of them, and don't let people embarrass you out of following your dream. It's amazing how many people just won't take that first step towards making a plan and then actually going down that road and using that inner lion to erase their fears. The other thing is perseverance. Perseverance, of course, we landed Perseverance rover on Mars yesterday, and that's a great name for a spacecraft, especially what this rover is about to do. But it's so important, to not give up. And that doesn't mean just blindly beating your head against a brick wall if you hit a dead end. Find a way around that dead end and kind of keep going towards your plan and continue to try to make it happen. Now, let me tell you another story about me. You might look at me and say, well, you're an astronaut. That's easy for you to say. You probably got straight A's without even studying things. None of that is true. I did well in my high school. I graduated near the top of my class, and I went to get my undergraduate degree at the University of California at Berkeley. And that is still the single hardest thing I've ever done in my life, is get through the chemical engineering program there with my undergraduate degree. There were plenty of times I wanted to. Maybe I thought about changing schools to an easier school. There are plenty of times I thought about maybe changing my major to something a little bit easier. But then I kind of got mad at myself, and I said, well, I'm not a dumb guy. I'm not, it doesn't come easy to me. I'm not the smartest guy here. But all it's going to take for me to get through all this is more hard work. And so instead of freaking out, I broke all the subjects down, the classes that I was having trouble with, studied extra hard, went and got help where I could get help and resources. And I kind of muscled through all that. And I was very, 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 very happy to graduate with not straight A's. I graduated with a B+ average. And I'm very proud of earning that B+ average. So my point to young people when I talk to them is, well, you don't have to be graduate at the very top of your class. I mean, you do the best you can, but it's that grit and determination that usually makes the difference. That same determination got me to NASA. When I was qualified, I did put my application into NASA. Fortunate enough to be called to interview, and then to get selected. And this is kind of a funny picture, obviously a long time ago. I guess we're about 30 years ago, and I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 pounds ago. I was part of the 13th astronaut group, the 13th group selected by NASA. We came from all across the country. We were a mixture of men and women. We were people from different cultural backgrounds, different heritages. We were different professions, certainly a lot of research engineers like myself, a lot of military test pilots from the different services. But in our class, in every class, we also have people with other backgrounds. In our class, we had a couple of medical doctors and a couple of physicists to round out the group. And we all reported to work here in Houston at the NASA Johnson Space Center and began our training to become astronauts. I was fortunate to fly all of my missions with international astronauts. So every one of my missions, I flew with at least one astronaut from another country, including people like Chiaki Mukai, pictured here. She was the first Japanese woman to fly into space. Trained with European astronauts, people like Jean-Jacques Favier, pictured here, a French astronaut. He's still a very good friend of mine. He got to fly his own shuttle missions some years later, and then went on to become a very senior official in the French Space Agency. 4 years after arriving, I did get my first chance to fly, and I flew aboard Space Shuttle Columbia. And as you can imagine, after having that dream for so long and working so hard, jumping through the hoops and getting a couple of lucky breaks and finally getting into the vehicle and getting to fly was very special. Looking back at the Earth, it was a surprisingly emotional moment because I think of all those factors, but I was really kind of awed by just how beautiful our Earth is. Our mission, we were the second international microgravity laboratory. And what that means is in the back of the shuttle payload bay, instead of having a satellite or something like that, we actually had a lab module created by the European Space Agency. And this is the main way we used to do scientific research in space before International Space Station. We would fly these 2-week lab missions. And in our case, we worked around the clock in 2 shifts, keeping that laboratory running around the clock. And by the time we ended our 2-week mission, we had accomplished over 80 different scientific investigations. Pretty quickly after I returned, I got turned around onto my second mission. This time I flew aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour. And the main purpose of the mission was to use the robotic arm of the space shuttle to retrieve a Japanese satellite that had been loaded with materials, different kinds of materials. And the idea was to study the effects of the low Earth orbit environment on these different materials to help us build more robust spacecraft in the future. But the biggest deal for me personally, it was the first chance I had to put on the big white spacesuit and lead my first 2 spacewalks, or what we call EVA, or extravehicular activity. What we were doing, we were testing tools and construction techniques that we would actually use later to build the International Space Station. After that flight, I stayed on the ground for a few years, continuing to help develop those tools with the engineers. I spent a lot of time in the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory, the world's largest swimming pool. We had mock-ups or models of space station elements, and we would go down, astronauts would go down and in our spacesuits, and we would use the water to be neutrally buoyant so that we could go through and practice and develop the detailed procedures that we were going to use to help build that big space station. Then on my 3rd mission, I got to put some of that into practice. This time I flew aboard Space Shuttle Discovery. We were the 2nd major assembly mission of the space station program. And so the space station was still pretty small when we got there, and even when we departed. This is the departing shot here. We brought 2 big pieces with us in the back of the space shuttle, used the robotic arm to position those pieces over the space station, and then over a series of 4 spacewalks and 2 teams, we went outside and physically bolted those structures down onto the station and connected up the electrical cables to bring them to life. We also installed the main data link between the station and the ground. This dish antenna, while my EVA partner held the 2 pieces together, I used a power tool and drove 4 bolts to attach this dish to that boom. We connected up the cables and swung it out, locked it into place. And even today, all of the video, high data rate things like video, and also all the telemetry or the data from the experiments all flow through that antenna, through the satellite system, down to the ground and into the Mission Control Center. After the landing of Space Shuttle Discovery, somehow 10 years had gone by. I had flown 3 space shuttle missions. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next when the chief asked me to join the Expedition Corps. And this is something I hadn't thought much about before, because up until that point, my career had pretty much been geared towards helping to build that big space station, and then helping to figure out how we're going to do it, and then participating in that construction process. And now I was being asked to shift gears a little bit. I was still going to be a flyer, but no longer would I be training to go fly a 2-week shuttle mission. Now I was training to go live and work aboard the station on what turned out to be a 6.5-month flight. And so I did take a couple of days to think about that. You know, it's not for everyone. I wasn't sure I wanted to live for half a year, a little more than half a year aboard a series of tin cans. But even when I decided I wanted to accept that challenge, the bigger commitment was actually training. We were going to be training for at least 3.5 years, which is, almost enough time to get another degree if you wanted to. We were going to spend half of that time in Russia, because Russia is the other major partner of the space station program. I had learned the Russian language pretty much to a fluent level, because not only did I have to learn their systems and their vehicle from their instructors who didn't speak English, but I also had to interact with their Mission Control Center. I had to interact with their senior management and work together and fly as a co-pilot of the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. So that brings me to something that especially the young people need to be thoughtful of, is, being aware that we really are a global society now. The Earth is shrinking because technology is bringing us together. Pretty much everyone is working with at least a few people from somewhere overseas. And so it's important to kind of, understand these cultural differences in order to be able to effectively communicate with each other. Different cultures have different ways of doing things. And just to give you some interesting examples, what's wrong with this picture? Two famous gentlemen shaking hands, it's no big deal. But in countries like Russia, you never shake hands over a threshold, and it's considered bad luck for both of you. I've never found a Russian who could really explain to me where that superstition came from, but they all know it, and they all don't do it. So when we Americans, when we showed up and we were kind of ignorant of all these things, where there'd be a knock at the door and we'd open it up and we'd stick our hand out to shake hands with the person on the other side, and that person would quickly jump inside before shaking hands, and we didn't figure out till later why. Another thing about luck, a lot of cultures, number of cultures, it's bad luck to wish someone good luck. Of course, here in the West, we wish our friends and our families good luck, and if they're going to be competing in a sporting event, or if they're going to be taking a big exam or something like that. But in many countries, many cultures, that's kind of a jinx. You're kind of jinxing that person. And so in these cultures, you would never throw a baby shower for an expecting mother. You would wait until the baby was born and everyone was healthy, and then you would give a gift to the family. Now, of course, you're going to be forgiven if you don't know these things, just like we forgive people who don't necessarily understand the way we do things right away. But if you figure out how to effectively communicate and observe some of the norms when you start dealing with people from different countries, it's so easy now with the internet. I always do a little research before I go to a new place or interact with people from a place I haven't before, just to learn a little bit of some of these kinds of things. Well, this is my home away from home. This was Star City, outside of Moscow, about 20 miles outside the border of Moscow, and in a beautiful big birch forest. But it looks nothing at all like the Johnson Space Center. It's the functional equivalent of NASA's Johnson Space Center here in Houston. Here's an example of that difference. This is a huge statue of Yuri Gagarin, the very first person ever to fly into space. This statue is about 1.5 stories tall. It's huge. And so I guarantee you'll never see statues like this here at NASA at the Johnson Space Center. Here's another big difference. This is the Russian Mission Control Center. What do you see here that you'll never see in the Mission Control Center in Houston? You see the advertising signs out in front? I pretty much guarantee NASA's never going to allow advertising in the Mission Control Center. The Russians have learned capitalism better than we have, it seems. And it's funny because most of those companies advertising are Western companies. Well, my space station mission was Expedition 10. We were the 10th flight to the ISS. We had a very talented graphic artist design our mission patch, and he took the 2 flags of the 2 major countries and made it Roman numeral 10. The name underneath mine is Salizhan Sharipov. He was a Russian Air Force colonel. He was my crewmate on that flight for the long duration part. Salizhan got to fly. He was a fighter pilot. He got to fly some of the cool airplanes I learned about when I was a kid. But even though he was a Russian Air Force colonel, in fact, the youngest full colonel at the time in the Russian Air Force, his ethnicity, his family background was from Uzbekistan, and he was born and raised in neighboring Kyrgyzia. So just a little piece of trivia, he and I comprised the first all-Asian heritage crew in space. Well, training was with the Russians was really interesting. They have different ways of doing things, but flyers are flyers, and so we're very operationally oriented, and so we definitely kind of click as soon as we meet each other. Getting to fly aboard a Russian Soyuz spacecraft was quite a different experience than flying aboard a space shuttle and launching out of Cape Canaveral at the Kennedy Space Center down in Florida. Launching from Baikonur, in either case, very different experience on this rocket than a space shuttle. But in either case, it only takes around 9 minutes to get from the launch pad up into low Earth orbit to our orbital speed of about 17,500 miles an hour. Main purpose of the space station is research work, so we did as many experiments as we could. But the main purpose of our series of missions at the time was maintenance and repair. We were flying only about 1.5 years after the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. Space Shuttle was still grounded back then, and so we needed the shuttle to resume flying so we could continue building the space station, because only the Space Shuttle could bring up the rest of the big pieces, the rest of the big modules, the truss elements, solar arrays, some of the big spares. And so in the meantime, back then, using only Russian assets, we could only supply a crew of 2 for the long duration. And so that meant that our main job was to do the scheduled maintenance and then to fix things that broke down. And that really took a lot of our time. Sometimes things that were never supposed to break down broke down. And so we had to work with the control centers to figure out how to get around all that. We did get to do 2 Russian spacewalks, and this was really a special treat for me because I'd become a specialist in using American spacesuits and American tools, and this was a chance to try out their system. On our first spacewalk, we went outside and we installed a remote-controlled robotics experiment, and we retrieved experiment packages that had been left outside by previous crews so we could return them to the ground with us and have the scientists analyze the results of those exposure facilities. On our second EVA, we furthered space station construction by installing navigation antennas that would be used by future cargo spacecraft, bringing supplies and equipment to the ISS. And Salizhan deployed a nanosat, just a little coffee can-sized satellite, And he did that just by throwing it off the back of the space station. Well, spaceflight really is a magical experience. It's a life-changing experience, as you might imagine. I talked about how beautiful our Earth is, and I'd be remiss if I didn't show you some pictures of the Earth. I shot over 16,000 photos of the Earth during this mission alone. So here are just a few of the highlights. This is looking over the Himalaya mountains into China, and from our perch of about 280 miles up, the snow-capped mountains look pretty small, but remember, buried down in there somewhere is Mount Everest, the tallest peak on the Earth. Here's some different places from around the world. This is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. That white spot in the middle of the photograph, that's the Grand Mosque where they have the annual pilgrimage. This is Beijing, the capital of China. Light snowfall helping to bring out some of the details. You can see the ring roads around the middle of the city. In the very center, you can see the big rectangle. That's the Forbidden City, where the old Chinese emperors used to live. This is Seoul, South Korea at night, brightly lit. You can see the river going through the middle of the city. You can make out the major streets by the street lights. Here's downtown Houston. Shows you what's possible with a little bit of practice on a clear day. I mentioned in space, you're traveling very fast, about 17,500 miles an hour, which works out to almost 5 miles every second. So you can't just put the camera in the window and shoot, because the image will smear and it'll look blurry. So you've got to learn to track the target as you release your shutter. You've got to focus, even though we're 280 miles away. You can't just put the lens over on infinity because it'll be blurry. So you have to focus. And by the way, you better hold on to something with your feet because you're weightless. And if you don't, you're just going to float away from the window. But with a little bit of practice, you can get pretty good. This is New Orleans. This is taken before the big hurricane and flood. Manhattan, New York City, again, showing you what's possible on a clear day with a little bit of practice and some good lighting conditions. Here's the southern tip of Florida, a very beautiful part of the world, South Florida and the Bahamas. The blues and greens are unlike anywhere else in the world. They just kind of jump out at you. Here are glaciers in Patagonia in Argentina. Here are the Great Pyramids at Giza in Egypt. You can see the two big ones pretty clearly. And if you look down from the two big ones, you can see the third smaller one. And if you look to the left of the third smaller one, you can make out the outline of the Sphinx. Now, people often wonder, what can you see with the naked eye from space? Once I found these pyramids and when we flew over again in good lighting conditions and clear weather, I could make out the two big pyramids with the naked eye as just two tiny, tiny, tiny little dots. Here's an area in the Ukraine. I'm not sure what they were up to back there, but my chemical engineering background suggests some kind of an evaporative recovery pond. Very unusual green color. Like I said, I'm not sure what they were up to. Made for a pretty picture, though. This is one of my favorites. This is Lake Nasser in Egypt and in sunglint. And I was able to take this picture when the sun was reflecting at just the right angle, almost perfectly off the surface of the water into the camera lens, and I was able to catch it. Well, sometimes Mother Nature's just funny. I saw this in January. I grabbed a camera and had the perfect thing to send down for Valentine's Day. Been kind of hard to top ever since, though. Well, 6.5 months was about up. It was time to start thinking about coming home. The Russian Mission Control Center asked us to put our pressure suits back on to make sure they still fit. Because in space, with the absence of gravity, your spine actually stretches out and relaxes, and you end up getting about 1.5 inches taller. So it's kind of crazy, but they have to account for that when they go ahead and build up your suit. We had a good chuckle about that, being operational guys. What were they going to do if our suits didn't fit? We were still going to come home. Here I am in the right side of the spacecraft for entry. You can see again just how small it is inside of there, pretty cramped, made even more so by all the bags of things that the control centers asked us to bring down with us. Well, Space Shuttle, of course, had wings. So once we got into the thicker part of the atmosphere, it would start to fly. It would glide down and land on a conventional runway. Depending on the skills of your commander that day, you probably have a pretty smooth landing. In the case of capsule spacecraft like Soyuz, you come down under a parachute. Even under the parachute, you're still falling pretty darn fast, about 25 feet per second. So in the middle panel, you can see about 3 feet off the ground, solid rocket motors fire to slow you down just before you hit the ground. But in the right panel, you can see even with all that, you still hit the ground pretty hard. We have other shock absorbing mechanisms in the spacecraft. When all that works, you hit pretty hard, but doesn't really hurt, at least not too much. The rescue forces were right on top of us. They followed us down in their helicopters, got us out of the vehicle in about 20 minutes, sat us down in lawn chairs, and handed us satellite phones so we could call our families and let them know that we were safe. After a quick ceremony in Kazakhstan, we got back on board the airplanes. They flew us back to Star City outside of Moscow, where we reunited with our families and our loved ones. And then to kind of start bringing it back around, I talked about earlier how the world really is shrinking in technology. You know, smartphones haven't been around that long. The internet has been just around just a little bit longer than that. But, you know, the world really has changed quite a bit, and it's continuing to accelerate. And so we're getting closer and closer. I mentioned that, you know, just about everyone is working with at least someone from overseas, and that's going to become more and more common. So for the young folks out there, the younger folks, your generation is going to be facing more challenges than any other generation before. But remember the flip side, your generation is going to have much more opportunity than any other generation before. Before I close, I want to talk about a couple of very exciting space missions. I mentioned briefly the Perseverance rover that landed on Mars. But first, I want to talk about Enceladus. This is one of the moons of Saturn. And this moon is very interesting because it's covered in liquid water. It's covered in oceans, but it's so cold out there that the entire surface is frozen. But there's liquid water underneath that ice. And what we've observed with the Hubble Space Telescope is plumes of water exploding through the ice, going up 50 or 60 miles in the atmosphere. This moon has an atmosphere before falling back down. And so we actually flew the Cassini spacecraft through one of those water plumes. And the Cassini spacecraft was able to sample the water and see what was in it. And of course, 95% of it was water. But then it found the presence of basic building blocks of life, like hydrogen. It found methane, which was really amazing. And so here on Earth, in the depths of our oceans, of our own oceans, we have what we call extremophile life, where scientists used to think it was too dark, too cold, and too high a pressure for life to exist. But there's volcanic activity in some of these regions, and that keeps the water warm. And so life actually does happen down there. Could the same thing be happening on a moon like Enceladus? Very interesting to think about. We've experienced similar things on one of Jupiter's moons called Europa. And thermal mapping has shown that it lines up where we've seen these plumes of water exploding through the ice of the oceans. And so very intriguing to think about the possibility of some kind of life existing in our own solar system, our own cosmic backyard. This is Comet 67P. A few years ago, the European Space Agency flew the Rosetta mission there. This comet was so far away during this mission, it took 30 seconds for a radio signal to go one way from the Earth to the spacecraft orbiting this tiny little comet. In fact, this comet is only about 4 miles across, and the gravity level is so low that if you were standing on it and you gave yourself a good jump, you'd fly right off into deep space. Nevertheless, they were able to put a small lander down, and the most exciting thing this lander found is in the ice of this comet was the presence of an amino acid, which of course is the basic building block of DNA, which is the fundamental building block of all life as we know it. So again, hints of the building blocks of life in our own cosmic backyard. Mars, I mentioned the Perseverance rover that landed. This is Curiosity, which landed some years earlier, and it's already sent back some amazing results. It found recently, just last year, it found the presence of embedded ammonia in sedimentary rock from billions of years ago. What that might suggest is perhaps there was some kind of a biological activity going on, maybe microbial activity that created this methane. There are other possible explanations, but again, tantalizing clues. And Perseverance is going to build on discoveries like this to specifically look for more direct chemical evidence of either past and perhaps even current life, perhaps underground, because we know there is liquid water still under the surface of Mars. As I said, Mars was a very different place 4 billion years ago, had huge oceans. The atmosphere was much thicker. It had magnetic fields like we do to protect the atmosphere from the sun. Once that magnetic field went away, over the billions of years, the radiation from the sun stripped away the atmosphere, all the water evaporated. So it's possible that there was life on Mars billions of years ago. The idea, of course, is to get boots on the ground there, to send astronauts to bring back some definitive proof, of life, hopefully, that we may find someday. And just think about what a discovery that would be. The Perseverance rover is also going to set aside samples. And in about 10 years, there's supposed to be a joint mission between NASA and the European Space Agency to send a spacecraft to go back and retrieve those samples. But we really do want to get boots on the ground. And for all you young people out there watching today, just think about, you might be the first person to set foot on Mars, and wouldn't that be cool? Well, finally, this is the last photo I want to leave you with. This is a picture of the moon. I shot this picture from the space station using the long lens. It was the moon that inspired me all those years ago to want to become an astronaut myself. On the left side, Mother Earth, home planet to all of us. And that blue in the middle is what I want to bring to your attention. That's what surprised me the most the very first time I flew into space. I looked back at the Earth and I saw that the sunlight passing through our atmosphere caused it to almost fluoresce these beautiful shades of blue. So this picture to me says dreams, and that's where it all begins. That's kind of part of what I talked about earlier in the presentation, the importance of having that dream and to keep moving forward. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and wish you all the very best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chiao. I know that you inspired a lot of our young viewers with your comments about the importance of health, diet, exercise, and sleep, and also hard work and reaching for your dreams. We do have some questions from our, the first question is from one of our young viewers. What do you do if you have motion sickness?
Motion sickness is something that's, I can get seasick. I mean, I used to go sailing with some of my friends, and sometimes I get seasick. But it's interesting, space adaptation syndrome, which is also a form of motion sickness because your inner ear, doesn't jive with what your eyes tell you. And but it's hard to predict. Sometimes the people that have been hit hardest with motion sickness in space have been hardened fighter pilots that are used to pulling G's and being, flying their jets around. And then other people who get seasick all the time don't have any issues at all. Sometimes some people get sick going up, some people get sick coming down, some people get sick going both ways or neither ways. In my case, I'm fine going up, but then I feel lousy when we come back. It takes me I feel really out of it and, dizzy and a little nauseous and things like that. So it really is individual, and you won't know until you go.
Okay, and another question from a young viewer. What was your favorite mission?
My favorite mission, well, of course, the first one is, I was so lucky to have these wonderful missions. My first one, just being the first one is great. Second one was the first time I got to do spacewalks. Third one, I got to help build the space station. And the fourth one, I got to be the commander of the station. So it's hard to pick one, I guess. If I had to pick one, I guess I would say the first one just because it was the first one. But the most rewarding mission was my space station mission because it was the most challenging and brought together all my experience and lessons learned from the previous ones.
There's another question. Does the space shuttle ever park and do your ears pop like when on a plane?
No, the space station, your ears do not pop because the pressure in the cabin, the space station or all spacecraft is maintained at a constant sea level pressure. And so it's just as if you were, at sea level. And so in an airplane, when you start going up, the pressurization system maintains the cabin at a pressure of about 8,000 feet. So once you go above 8,000, you'll stay at that pressure, but going from sea level up to 8,000, your ears will pop to equalize.
Okay. And does your spine shrink again when you get back home?
Yeah, before you get too excited about getting taller in space, within an hour of being on the ground, you're back to your normal height.
Okay, and then what were the differences between Russian and American spacesuits, and which was more comfortable during a spacewalk?
It's interesting because, what I learned from my experiences like training for so many years in Russia and working with them is that, we usually think of cultural differences as, social things, the way we greet each other or socialize, the food, things like that. But really, it's everything. It's technology too. So if you look at Russian spacecraft, Russian spacesuit versus American, they're very, very different. They're like two different automobiles. They both get you to the same place, but they're very different. I mean, think about the difference between a Corvette and a Ferrari and a Porsche. They're all high performance sports cars, but they're very different in their approach to engineering and to styling and things like that. So both spacesuits work very well. The Russian spacesuit both have pluses and minuses. The Russian spacesuit operates at a higher pressure. It's more stiff. The gloves come in two sizes, medium and large. Pick the one that fits you the best. It's one size fits all. It has these cables in the arms and the legs that you pull up to markings, and to get them to the right dimension for you. On the other hand, the American suit is custom made. My gloves were molded to my hands, so they fit very well. We operate at a lower pressure, so it's more flexible. It's easier to do more fine detail work. The helmet is detachable, so you have much better peripheral vision. But the negative of the American suit is that it takes a lot more to get going and to get outside, because you have to lower down to that lower pressure. And so that means you have to pre-breathe pure oxygen for a while, or you have to do an exercise protocol, and it's more complicated. The Russian suit is much easier to get back in and out. But so ideally, I guess, if you were going to do some really detailed work, would you use the American suit? And otherwise, if you need to get in and out quickly, you'd use the Russian suit. But of course, the political realities, if you're working on the Russian side, you use the Russian suit. If you're working on the American side, you use the American suit. But both very capable.
Okay. Here's another question from one of our young viewers. What was your favorite subject in middle school?
My favorite subject in middle school, I would say, I really liked science in middle school, and math. Math was something I, usually could figure out and understand. And so that let me do, some of the things in science. And that's why I mentioned those 2 missions at the end of my presentation. I want to get, especially the young people, thinking about some of the cool things out there in science, and the possibility of finding life on Mars, or the evidence of past life on Mars, even if it was just microbial, like single cell kind of life.
Okay, we have lots of questions, so I'm just reading them out. How long does it take after you come back to Earth before you can walk normally again? And what's the strangest part of being back on the ground?
Sure. I mean, even after a short 1-week shuttle mission, 2-week shuttle mission, you come back and you're very, very dizzy. When you go up, you're very dizzy because your brain doesn't know what to do with these confusing signals coming from your inner ear. Your inner ear, your balance system is telling you that you're gyrating in all 3 axes, but your eyes tell you you're not. So that's what makes you dizzy and maybe feel nauseous. Even after a couple of weeks, when you come back to Earth, your brain learns to ignore all that. But after you've come back, your brain's forgotten what to do with those signals. So it's got to relearn what to do with that. And so the consequences, again, you feel very dizzy and you can feel nauseous. And so even after a short mission, it can take, at least a couple of days before you kind of feel like you've got your balance again, and you can, feel like you're kind of getting back to normal. After a long mission, like six months or more, it takes, the symptoms are a little more intense and it takes longer to readapt. In our case, it took us about a week. Some crews take much longer, 2 or 3 weeks or even 4 weeks. But I credit our quick adaptation to our commitment to getting up and walking around to get our balance back, and then starting to exercise as soon as we got that balance back, because the exercise really helps you readapt more quickly.
Okay. Another question, is it possible that Mars's orbit shifted, the distance from the sun shifted over a period of time, such that the possibility of water and life existed before it moved further from the sun?
I don't think it's because Mars shifted. What happened is Mars used to have a liquid metal core, just like the Earth does. And what happened is that core cooled down and it stopped rotating. When that planet was rotating and that liquid core was rotating, that's what produced the magnetic fields. That's what produces our magnetic fields. And it's those magnetic fields that trap most of the charged particles of radiation coming at us from the sun. And so over billions of years, that core solidified on Mars, so it no longer has that liquid core. And that's why the magnetic fields went away. And that's why the radiation of the sun over those billions of years stripped away the atmosphere to what it is today. The pressure on Mars is only 6/1000ths that of the pressure here on Earth.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, how have your intercultural experiences helped you with your current role? And maybe also, how did it help?
Sure, yeah, no, I mean, my experiences with other cultures through NASA and other, travels and things like that helped me quite a bit. I mean, growing up, I think, in a 2-culture family, my parents very much kept the Chinese culture and things like that at home, but then I grew up in mainstream America. So I definitely had one foot in each culture. And I think that helped me give me perspective. Similarly, having spent so much time in Russia, that gave me perspective, additional perspective. And I think each time you get to know a different culture, different people, and experience that, you can see how that perspective is going to help you in any kind of business you're in. And for an example, we would talk. I mean, we were friends, and so we would talk about different political things that were going on where the United States and Russia were either, butting heads or disagreeing on, something going on in another country. But I learned to understand their position because I understand how they think. I understood, that culture. And so I think that helps you to be able to communicate effectively, and that's going to help you no matter what business you're in.
Okay. You've had lots of lovely photographs. Were you a photographer before you were an astronaut, or was that something you took on just to take pictures in space?
I got into photography when I was very young. I mean, I actually had one of those little black and white film developers when I was a kid, and a little enlarger. I could make little prints, with the orange light bulb, put that in the garage, and wait till nighttime, and I could print little photographs. But I really wasn't, really wasn't a hobby as I got older. And so it became a hobby again when I went into space. And, it was just so interesting to photograph all these different parts of the world. And I became pretty good at it. But, when I came back, after I came back, of course, the camera phones got to be so good that almost nobody carries, the big cameras anymore, except the professionals. So most of the pictures I take these days are just on my iPhone.
Okay. Do you look at robotic missions like to Europa and wish that you could go in person? And as a second part, can astronauts do things that robots can't?
Right. So robotic missions are very important. I think the robotic missions and human missions complement each other very well. We always send the robotic missions first to see what's there and to learn more about the environment before we try to send humans. That's certainly what we did with the moon. That's what we're doing with Mars. As far as going to Europa, well, that's a long, long voyage, until we figure out better technology and how to go faster or something like that. That's probably a 6+ year, one way going out there. And, we don't have the technology to basically build spacecraft that can last that long yet. So for me personally, I'd rather stay closer to home. I'd rather send robots out to places like that. And some of those discoveries they've made are just fascinating. I would love a chance to go to Mars, though. Mars is pretty close. It's closest approach. One-way trip is 6 to 8 months. And so that's not too bad.
Okay, and one last question. Did, and if so, how did your space experience prepare you for the COVID quarantine?
There are a lot of similarities between long duration spaceflight and this lockdown that we found ourselves in. But the difference, the biggest difference, though, I mean, we have the same tools. We use video conferencing. We actually have a voice over IP phone on board. We can make short phone calls down to the ground when the antenna is pointing at the satellite. We email. Of course, we have email. And now, for a number of years, they've had real-time internet, whereas we didn't have that when I was there, but they have it now. But the biggest difference is I knew what I was getting into. I trained for 3.5 years. I thought about accepting the mission, whether I wanted to do it. With this pandemic, it all came about very quickly and seemingly just over the course of several weeks, suddenly, the whole world was shutting down. And so I think that was the biggest challenge, is people not having a chance to mentally prepare. But my advice to people in this era, and things hopefully are going in the right direction. Vaccines are getting out there and they seem to be effective. But I always tell people, hey, get outside. That's one thing we couldn't do on the space station. We couldn't just go for a walk, go enjoy nature. That's what I really missed the most during my long duration flight. Even though we could look down at all the natural beauty of the earth, we were very much in a sterile, far away viewing position. We weren't actually I missed the, small animals like birds and squirrels and smelling the grass and things like that.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Chiao. It's been so wonderful to have you join us this evening. And so maybe we can just do a virtual.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, it's been a pleasure. I hope you all enjoyed it. And like I said, very happy to be part of GVSU's conference this year. And I wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Okay. And for all the participants in the audience, don't forget there's a link in the chat about a survey that we would really appreciate you filling out. And also, if you didn't manage to get tickets for the Wurlitzer show tonight at the Grand Rapids Public Museum, that will be posted on the YouTube channel that's also posted in the chat. So thank you, everybody, and we'll close the session now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.